Hi, Dave and Camille. Thank you for being here today. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So, I want to dive right in. To start, can you describe how ransomware attacks have evolved over the past year and also explain why it's so important for manufacturing companies to have a business continuity plan in case of a cyber attack?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to look at things in the context of when it will happen rather than if, right? With the evolution of ransomware, as you're mentioning, you're talking about commoditized stuff that used to be, script kiddie, compromise, that sort of thing. IT has already caught up and learned how to defend from most of that. But since OT environments tend to be lagging a bit, what we're seeing now is the acknowledgement that OT environments are lagging a bit. So therefore, they become manufacturing organizations, for example, will become sort of low-hanging fruit and easy to compromise. So it's more a matter of being aware, being ready to face the consequences of what might happen when you do get compromised.
So, Dave, considering how these ransomware attacks have increased, what steps can industrial firms take to proactively prepare and even if they need to recover from an attack? It sounds like it would be a nightmare.
Yeah, it's pretty much what does your worst day look like? And that's the scenario that you're looking at because you're talking about stops in production, stops in making money. There's public consequences, PR. There's your clients as well. Perhaps you're manufacturing like a subcontract for another customer, that sort of thing. And all of that is all interlinked and everything. So it's important to look at it in the sense of what is my plan that's in place? Have I considered all of these options, not just the simple, where do I restore from the backups, but what do you do comprehensively? And how do you control the messaging behind it? How do you look at what you do from not even from a technical standpoint? And then most importantly, have you practiced it? Have you tried running through an exercise like a drill? Have you gone through it? Have you had anyone look at how good or bad you might have done? Uh, it's important to have a solution that you know will work.
And Camille, how about you? Do you have something to add?
Yeah, I I fully agree with Dave in the sense that, we are seeing just a level of sophistication and frequency are the terms that, I like to use often when it comes to the volume of ransomware attacks and how frequent they occur, just significantly increasing year over year. And what we used to think about in terms of certain industries being more of a target, primarily, banking, finance, healthcare, this means that like industries such as critical infrastructure and OT manufacturing are not off the table, right? And the key objective here is ransom by financial gain or disruption of operations. And so if I think about organizations and their ability to take like a proactive approach to it, one of the biggest missteps I see is people rush to just think about technology first and go implement it. When I think the better approach is customers really have to, or our clients really have to think about what is the state of their overall cyber hygiene, right? Like what is their risk profile? And many of them are really good at knowing what their risk profile is in the enterprise space, to Dave's point, because they've been at this for a long time, right? They have funding, they've got maturity of technology, they have a changeover of technology that happens much more frequently than in the OT world. So they have a discipline and they have a rhythm in which they do that. But in the OT space in particular, I would say before you go rush to implement a particular technology, understand what your vulnerabilities are, right? Understand what your attack surface or your threat vectors are. Make sure that you have a clean, what I would call a cyber hygiene program, or at least the basic steps to go do that. And you want to get a sense of, what are your assets? Where are they baselined? Are you utilizing something as simple as a compliance framework? So we're seeing this push in the industry for a lot more regulation, a lot more framework compliance. I like to refer back, and I think Dave does too, to think about governance, risk, and compliance, and think about a risk-based approach like NIST 2.0, which allows us to think through governance and identification, protection levels, response and recovery planning. But each of these customers can do proactively or reactively. I think formulating a response plan, having communication plans, doing things like tabletop exercises, as Dave mentioned, to simulate, right? What would you do in the event of an attack? are ways that you can proactively prepare for all of this rather than waiting for what we call the trigger incident and then rushing to triage getting your restorations back up and running. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, and I do think the approach is commonly, because if you look at any kind of framework, the first items are know what you have and know what your vulnerabilities are. Yes, that's well and good, but what do you do beyond that? And that's really where I see a lot of organizations will just look at what's my inventory, what am I subject to? But then there's a realization that I can't patch this. I can't do anything about this vulnerability. What are my steps forward there? And there's very few um, people out there who'll give you the guidance necessary for that. And that's really what you want to look for, a solution that can offer you what can I do to shore up my defense from an overall kind of holistic view.
Yeah.
So, Kamil, along those lines, when you both are working daily with your clients and you focus with them on improving cyber hygiene and risk posture. First, can you define what those both are for people who might not know?
Yeah, we like so hygiene is a fun word, right? We like to use very simple examples. You think about kind of brushing your teeth, right? The more you do it, the better hygienic state that you're in. And the same applies to safety compliance, right? In a manufacturing environment would apply the same to security. The more often that you're proactively thinking through testing, simulating, taking action, deploying countermeasures, the better overall sense of security you're going to feel, right? The more secure you're going to feel overall. Taking a steps based on a compliance framework, whether you're doing them proactively or reactively, if you're looking at identification of risk, deploying countermeasures as part of your protection mechanisms, putting in tools or technology that allow you to do real-time threat detection, standing up incident response planning. These are all ways that you actually get a strong risk posture, right? So you think about like, what is that meaning of a posture? For some people, it could be, I've evaluated people, process, and technology. So those to me are the three core pillars. Risk is associated with your people risk, the risk in your processes, and the risk of essentially not having the right or too much technology. And then what I call kind of the golden triangle, which is every client has a different risk appetite. They've got different levels of risk avoidance that they're comfortable with, and then they're all aiming for some levels of protection. So to me, it's people, process, technology, and what is your triangle of appetite, risk avoidance, and levels of protection. That's really how we start to take a look at hygiene measures. There's not one customer that I work with that is the same, right? I think some of them use good, better, and best models. But I think the second piece of it is like ensuring that people are aligned to the mission. So every day when I consult with customers, we see a difference across the globe, right? Based on industry around people that have a security first culture versus those who don't. And what that means is extending the accountability and responsibility of who owns security to much more than, a practitioner in the OT space or an IT director. This means having people in like HR and finance, your IT and OT teams, potentially a sustainability team, your safety directors, plant leadership. I mean, the list goes on. But in order to create that mission and that cultural awareness, you have to have a cross-functional group at the table today, very different than 3 or 5 years ago. And then I would say the third thing is making sure that we're speaking common language. I think we often lose translation of like, what is it we think we need to do versus what is it that teams are rushing to do. If we're not speaking common language between IT and OT teams, it makes it very difficult to lead towards kind of an aligned mission state and get to a better state of security hygiene. So using the common language, making sure people are aligned to the mission, making sure we understand our levels of tolerance of risk, what protection levels that we want. And ultimately that's what helps us.
I think
And
that mutual respect aspect in there between where you have to start is going to be IT and OT in general. On the topic of common language, I always go back to the example. Alan Bradley and Rockwell named the protocol Ethernet IP. If you say that to an IT person, they're going to look at you like you have three heads because they're two different things, right? And they'll stop and say, that's not a thing. Or I see OT folks all the time will say they're referring to layer one, layer two, layer three. but they'll say level 1, level 2, level 3, and that's going to make any IT guy wince, right? So that language is the greatest example there. If you are all on the same page, what does this mean to you and your part of the organization? The more quickly you can foster that relationship, and that's really where it all starts. That respect has to be there.
Yeah, and Dave, keep me honest here, but sometimes when I'm working with clients, it's interesting because they'll have in mind an execution plan that they want to go achieve, right? And we'll put some cost behind it, but they'll come back to us and say, well, our CISO didn't approve. It wasn't clear, why we're asking for this investment. It's essentially building this business case. And so we challenge the client back and we say, well, when you talk to finance, right, or the C-suite, what language were you using, right? Did you speak in the sense of like business continuity planning, resiliency, overall business impact, right? To a CFO, for example, and say, if we don't do this, our financial risk due to this cyber incident is going to be X amount of millions of dollars, right? To me, that's like common language versus saying, hey, I'm working with a vendor, I need $1 million of investment. I'm not sure what the ROI is, but we have to do this because it's cybersecurity, right? So again, that's a good example of common language, bringing people together at the table, speaking in their terms, but making security a holistic part of every function that has to participate kind of in the enterprise.
Absolutely.
Well, based on your experience, do you have tips on what you've seen work and not work that would help develop a unified IT and OT culture that they can work together as a strategy?
Yeah,
So,
I would.
sorry.
No, you're all good. I mean, I would always recommend, and this is just my take on it, right? But make sure that when it comes to governance models or decision making, everybody has very clear understanding of what their role is, whether they're in IT, in OT, the C-suite, a director level, a practitioner, a plant operator. Like, what is your role in security? And clear lines of demarcation, right? Don't muddy the water and trying to essentially create 5 or 6 different job functions for an individual. Because the example I love to use is, look, 30 years ago, like our operators on the front line of these manufacturing plants, their sole responsibility was to wake up in the morning, go make sure they're making a quality product, that they're competitive in the market, that they're consistent in the quality of what they're producing, and ultimately help grow the revenue and growth of that company. Now they're on the front lines of like nation state attackers, and we've never trained them to be a defense mechanism, right? So you shouldn't make sure that a frontline operator pushing a button or operating a machine becomes your first line of defense for cybersecurity. It's a shared responsibility. The second thing I would say is you have to make sure that it's part of larger enterprise risk management. So again, if you go back to kind of people, process, technology, the executive and the C-suite, they have their mission, right? They have to protect the entire enterprise. That could be the vendor risk management aspect of it. It could be the overall supply chain of people who they operate in within the enterprise. HR has to think about the workforce component, which is we have a lot of resource deficiency in cybersecurity. They're hard to find. It's very expensive. The problem becomes exponentially worse when you kind of look across the globe in terms of markets that haven't historically invested in early education for cybersecurity experts. So lines of demarcation are important. Common language is important in governance models, having clear roles and responsibilities and what that means for a C-suite versus a general manager, I think are really kind of key things. Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
No, you're pretty much saying what I'm saying. It's the I would even boil it down to sort of put your ego aside. Neither side wants to look like they're arrogant or having something foisted upon them, right? What you need is that buy-in, that agreement, and that the knowledge that this is what the benefits are. And this is always good stuff to hash out with all the personnel, even before you present it to the C-suite, right? If you're going to make the presentation to your CISO, CISO is going to see, okay, both parts of the organization are totally behind this, and they've established a dollar figure. Our justification for this is sound, and they'll feel more comfortable doing it rather than just saying, oh, well, the cybersecurity team needs to take care of that, but they don't even know what a PLC is, for example. So it's just fundamentally different things that need to come together, and part of that is that respect and ego dropping.
I think what's interesting too, and we were consulting with a client last week, and they came to us and they said, help us determine like what is our 5-year time horizon of hiring people? How many people in security do we need in OT, and what do you think those roles should be? And our response was a little bit different. I would say I love the fact that they're proactive, but even think about clients are on the more mature end of the curve, even creating net new roles like director of enterprise risk management, right? Very specific functions, director of OT security, right? Whereas before we used to see some of these OT teams roll up into a common, IT reporting structure, which is totally fine and still happens. More line of sight, a little bit of kind of direct process flow, but keeping an open mind to the fact that in the future, there were going to be a lot more net new roles that we don't even conceive today with the introduction of generative AI and security and other things that are happening from a technology standpoint where people are going to need to think and operate differently. So it's important to baseline, what are the workforce needs that you need today in a governance model versus what do you think the workforce needs are going to be in the future before you just kind of rush to say we need X amount of people. First, you got to figure out what are those people going to be doing, right? So
No, it's
that's just an
absolutely
additional
true.
context.
Yeah, no, and I've run into similar cases with that. There was an organization that was they pretty much flat out asked us, well, how many people should be on my team for our size? And I can't give you the answer to that. It's all based on what your specific needs are. But here are some examples of what has been done in the past, what we've seen. Just how do you control uh, specifically in manufacturing, you're going to see a lot of cases where every facility is its own little kingdom, and then they're not going to want to listen to corporate for any reason. But how do you get around that? How do you establish that authority? And it's really, like I said, it comes down to dropping the ego, right? It's got to work together, otherwise nothing's going to happen.
So you're talking about net new titles, but right now for companies that don't have like a director of OT, how do they decide who's responsible for OT cybersecurity?
That's similar to the question of how many guys do we need, right? It's you know every organization is going to know their own personalities of people and who might be able to interact with that. You do, as far as leadership goes, is it about the most technical knowledge? No, it's really about who can foster the best relationships, who can actually establish trust and make that happen, right? So that's why I would say probably your most diplomatic person might be the best way to go, rather than somebody who just really knows a lot, because a lot of that comes with the for lack of a better term, arrogance associated with knowing their products and knowing their equipment that well. It doesn't necessarily translate to being a good leader.
That's logical advice. And also, you both have referenced governance models and decision-making structures. Can you explain what those are and how they work?
Dave, you want to go first?
Not particularly.
Yeah.
You can cut
Yeah,
that out.
to me, decision-making structures are ensuring, I'll give you a contextual example, right? So one of the things that we recommend that customers do are cyber simulation techniques. So a good example is what we call a tabletop exercise. And a tabletop exercise is a simulation where you bring key stakeholders across your organization, to a table, and you run different scenarios. And the whole intent of the scenario is to map out your decision making, right? So if I get hit by a ransomware attack, what is the first step I take? And if you were to just ask a blank room of people who have never done this in an organization, you're probably going to get a lot of different opinions, right? So the first thing that you want to establish is like a chain of decision making, right? So decision making structure before you come up with who communicates to who do we think is going to raise their hand to be literally the first person in the enterprise, and sometimes that is the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, to raise their hand and say, my team is going to own the next sequence of steps, right? Another scenario would be, okay, we've identified we've been hit by ransom attack. Do we pay the ransom? That is a very clear scenario in a tabletop exercise. And I'm not going to tell you if there's a right or wrong answer to that. It comes down to the enterprise and the risk tolerance and insurance liability and all kinds of other things. But we want to make sure that people go through these scenarios, they practice it so that there's no confusion, right? Because on moment one of being hit by an attack, the clock starts, right? So you're looking at production downtime. You're potentially looking at human loss of life casualty. You're looking at supply chain disruption, and the dollars are adding up, right? When you're the enterprise, and you have to make decisions quickly. So establishing that type of simulation will tell you who needs to do that based on the authority that you have, and then you can actually build out an organizational structural map that says, okay, we have to go do this. Now we have to go train 20, 30, 50, 100 people to know that in the case of these scenarios or these outcomes, these are the steps that we have to take. That kind of leads you into an overall governance model, which is, to me, what functions need to be present in an organization to make the right decisions, right? Do we have the chief financial officer on board to say, yes, in every situation, we're going to pay out a ransom, right? Well, how do you even quantify how much that's going to be? You're going to need that in a governance model. Do we have the safety director on board to make sure that somebody's going to go through plant by plant and make sure that nothing is going to harm our human labor force, right? So to me, these are, kind of common models of decision making, but they all start with kind of a simulation exercise to make sure. And the third component of that is communication, right? So yes, you have to assess, yes, you have to prioritize, yes, you have to simulate, but then you got to communicate, right? So who's responsible for internal communication versus external communication? Two very different things, right? So you don't want the media to be the first one informing everybody that you've been hit by a ransomware attack and you finding out, right, as you work for this company. And so you have to have a controlled chain of communication that allows both internal and external stakeholders to know what's happening, who's responsible, who do they need to communicate to. That all, to me, is like a governance model and a set of decision-making structures that we can help clients kind of get to.
Yeah, I really like that emphasis on testing it, right? You don't come up with a backup plan without testing the restore capability of it, right? For just from a data standpoint. It's exactly the same thing. It's to highlight weaknesses that exist and how do you fill those gaps. The one thing that comes to mind with tabletop exercises that I've been involved in, there's always a certain subset of people who kind of look at this, is this an indictment of what I put together? And it's important to say, no, we're not here to judge you as a person, but this plan as a company and all of those things like communication. How do you work? What's the procedure? What is the way we do this? And in a lot of senses, finding a lot of failures is good because it gives you something to address. And how do you move forward from that?
I love it. And
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things Dave and I discussed previously too, in some of these other, public conversations we have, is like the rate of turnover of people in manufacturing, but not predominantly in cybersecurity, is just like getting exponentially worse, right? So finding talent is hard, right? When we kind of read some of the research by Gartner and other firms, it says, the average lifespan of like senior leadership involved in cybersecurity is 2 years or less because the rate of burnout is crazy. So essentially what you have is like an environment where you have a leadership team that's done testing and simulation and all these things that we just talked about that are really good to an organization. But throughout that kind of time horizon, all of a sudden people start dropping off the map. You've got new individuals coming in that are running your facilities. You've got, people are leaving at an alarming rate. You've got net new younger talent that you want to train, and you've got potentially a couple executives exiting, and you've got new fresh perspectives coming in. But nobody has really done that transition, that change management between here's our old IT/OT, risk governance plan. Here's how we're going to implement it with a new set of leadership techniques, right? Or differences of opinions. You have to go through that assessment and prioritization and simulation work again to make sure everybody's on the same page. I think where we see people fall down is they just inherit what was given to them. They think it's going to work. They have different people in different roles that have not been trained or skilled to do that. And then it's not that they didn't have the right plan. They failed in the execution because they didn't practice it, right? So that's just, it kind of validates what Dave was saying around.
And manufacturers are like fighting on the front lines of cyber attacks. They have attackers, nation states, and even increasing ways of attackers to get into their networks and systems. So do they need to think how their adversaries think? Is that even important and possible? And how would you suggest a call to action or what steps they could take to prepare as much as possible?
Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges, and the things I mentioned earlier was that you have that knowledge that manufacturing in particular might be lagging in technology and lagging in defense. You become that low-hanging fruit. What am I going to do if I want to extort ransom from somebody? Well, I'm going to go after the easiest target, right? So the problem there is that everybody has this mentality of, I'm not a target. I just make bread. I just make, I make these nails or something like that, just or a commodity product of any kind, really. And it's sort of like, why would I be a target? It's because you're easy to get to. That same mentality, which is discouraging investment and know-how and competence in protecting the environment, is going to lead to you not having the resources and becoming an even easier target. And then you got to think also in terms of, if I'm a nation state threat actor and I'm most concerned about you building, your government building a fighter jet. Am I going to go after the manufacturer of the fighter jet? No, you're going to go after somebody who makes, maybe it's a just mom and pop shop squared kind of outfit, and you're going to go after that because they make a simple mechanism that is part of another piece and all in that supply chain. We all saw that during the pandemic. Remember those thousands of cars that were missing a $5 microchip because we couldn't get them. The exact same principle applies. So if your adversary is thinking that way, you need to think that way too. And I think the summation to that is really everyone needs to get their head out of the sand and recognize that this is a problem. It's going to continue to be a problem. And the worst possible thing you can do is do absolutely nothing, or think of it in terms of, we've been doing it this way for 25 years. Why would I change it? Right? It's just the evolution needs to be there.
Yeah, I would I think what I would add, Dave, too, is like, I know you've said this to me in the past, but we see a lot of customers that think that, doing nothing is they're so confused about what to do, so they do nothing. Or they say, we're okay with our levels of risk, right? Now, don't forget that an adversary or a nation state's objective is to wake up every morning, make money, cause harm and disruption, and have dedicated people within their community to go do this 24/7. We don't operate like that, right? We're on the offensive side. The receivers of an adversarial attack, we're sitting here going, hey, we want to conduct normal life and be safe and wake up and go to work and do all these great things. The best thing to do to try to think like an adversary is, number one, don't think of cybersecurity hygiene as these like one-off event scenarios, right? Hey, I'm going to go do a risk assessment, and then it sits on your desk and it's communicated maybe to the board once, and 6 months later you pick it up and you say, oh yeah, we were red in that category. We probably should do something about that, right? That adversary is going to keep coming at you probably 30, 40, 50 times a day for 5 years, maybe even was successful, but is not going to actually activate the ransomware, right, for several years later until it's completely perpetrated your entire enterprise. So thinking about cyber hygiene as a continual, ongoing, assess, implement, design, reconsider, simulate, test, train, communicate. These are things that you should be doing as often as possible, because that reduces your overall kind of threat landscape, right? It doesn't allow the adversary the ability to kind of go to sleep at night saying, well, they haven't done anything in 4 months. Now's my day, right? They just keep trying until they kind of get through.
So to add to that as well, when I think about the incidents that we typically respond to, when we get those calls from panicked clients who have been compromised, and what do we do? We didn't have a plan in place, that sort of thing. The timing of that also tends to be during the most under-resourced times, a Friday, a holiday weekend, a holiday week, just a known time where you're going to be understaffed and under-resourced, right? So take that into consideration as well. That's the time that I would choose, because I know that there's going to be fewer personnel to address it. And it's really, just remember, these are not good people, and you have to put yourself in the mindset of, if I was a criminal, if I was a bad guy, what would I do, right? And then just think about the considerations with that, whether it's timing, whether it's procedures, whether it's up or down. Is this a problem or not? Yeah, it will be a problem for you. And I know in manufacturing in particular, there's, I run into it all the time. You guys, Dragos, you're looking at all these threat activity groups, all these tactics that they use, all their methodologies and everything like that. I don't care. I'm just here to make my product, right? We got to start caring collectively.
I probably the last thing I would add to that too, because Dave just mentioned it, but this is like naturally where our two companies tend to shine together in a partnership, because what Dragos is really good at in terms of real-time threat detection, monitoring, threat intelligence, threat feed, these are also ways that we can limit the risk of an adversary being successful, meaning if you're at the right stage of your journey where you've done your assessment work, you feel like you've got good incident response and planning, but really what you're missing is real-time threat detection capabilities that you want to be able to put in place. To Dave's point, that's one way that you can try to at least know, right? Who's trying to get into your system? How frequently is it happening? Was it, did it actually happen? And prevent that breach in real time. But additionally to that, like you're feeding that information to a team of security operations operators that have 24/7 eyes and ears to monitoring those operations. Now we see that like not everybody can do that. It's extremely expensive. So picking the right partner, not only that can help you implement a platform, give you threat intelligence so you kind of know what's happening in the market, and then tune that towards your system to say, okay, if something were to happen, we know how we're going to respond. We know how many alerts we're getting. We know how many oftentimes people have tried. We're going to be able to go take immediate action versus saying, uh-oh, something happened. Now we have to go do all of these things to protect ourselves, right? So that's just kind of another data point.
That is part of that evolution as well. Like I think about when the client calls in a panic, it's because they didn't have a plan and they didn't know what to do. They didn't have anything in place to respond. And it's really we don't offer any kind of 24/7 service on that. We offer sort of interim supplements. Our personnel can supplement your existing security team. But then if you're looking for that security operations center type of monitoring, specifically for OT environments, that is when we have those partnerships like with Rockwell. And yeah.
Well, with all this in mind, it's a lot for a company to think about. So to wrap up here, can you talk about some immediate improvements in cyber hygiene companies can implement to enhance their resiliency and prepare?
Yeah. We mentioned a lot of it today already, right? But even if you think about some of the most basics, I would still say understanding your entire landscape of your assets that are installed in the environment in OT is absolutely critical. You can't protect what you don't know you have, right? That's the way that we typically refer to it. But it's not just identification of the asset, it's, what's the vulnerability associated with that? Am I getting a correlated risk impact? And there are different platforms and tools and methodologies and, human type of ways that we can go achieve that. That's still at the forefront of like why the identify stage of NIST is absolutely critical for everybody, and to do that often, because that is your first line of defense, right? Is the asset that is the most vulnerable with the highest risk. If it's not protected, well, then there you go. Um, the second I would say is like basic patch management programs and philosophies, right? It's very difficult when we talk to IT organizations about how they're going to go deploy or develop a patch management program in the operational environment, because you got to work around production scheduling and downtime, and if you're on a platform for an oil and gas operation, you can never really shut it down, right? So you got to really think about how this is going to actually impact when you put those things into play. We still recommend basic measures like having a defensible architecture, which I'm going to let Dave talk about the 5 critical controls, but segmentation, separating logically and physically the worlds between IT and OT, absolutely having some sort of real-time threat detection, picking a partner that's what we called an MSSP, a managed security services provider that can have eyes and ears into the operation 24/7, that has like, the domain expertise that truly understands manufacturing versus trying to go build a skill set and spend a lot of money to go do that on your own. And then having things like an incident response plan stood up, ready to go with communications plans in place. Like to me, that's how you enhance resiliency. Those are immediate things you can do today to get you started. But I'm gonna let Dave talk about the critical controls.
I'm also thinking of the one of the most obvious things that we see is IT is not aware of certain types of remote access tools that are being used in their environment, and what you're doing is just introducing another vector that IT isn't monitoring, and therefore OT probably isn't, because most places don't have that if they're using equipment like that. And it's part of that mentality of, I need to get the job done. These are my restrictions. These are engineers. They're going to find a way around it. And, you might have heard the term shadow IT. You hear that all the time. Um, what it comes down to, though, as Camille mentioned, the five critical controls is a document written by Dragos founder Rob Lee and Tim Conway of SANS, and it's published via SANS, and it's effectively taking all the frameworks and putting them into plain English. Like, it's not numerical ratings, it's not colored highlights, it's just five elements that tell you comprehensively what are the real steps you need to take? What is the actual end goal? And you're talking about getting that incident response plan. You're talking about having a defensible architecture, which is probably the most difficult and potentially disruptive, but also in a way the most important way to go about it. Risk-based vulnerability management and patch management, like Camille said, you also don't know if these patches are going to disrupt communications between devices, and the software that programs them doesn't, you might upgrade and this software doesn't work. You might say, oh, this computer's running Windows XP. How can we have this in our environment? And that's really what you need to consider, because IT will always go in and say, there's a vulnerability, patch it. If we patch the vulnerability, it's no longer vulnerable and we're all good. Sometimes you just can't do that. So it's not even just the downtime aspect, but it's how are you really going to disrupt it when you do it, and if you do it. And then who is going to give you what to do if you can't patch, right? And that's something to look at as far as comprehensive strategy. Other pieces would be having that remote access under control, have a single unified means of doing it, and not having elements all over the place. If you've gone through the trouble of standing up a industrial demilitarized zone in your environment, for example, you have devices bypassing that. How are you monitoring that? How are you doing that? And that's, again, one of the controls there, remote access, and then having the monitoring to have the visibility. A lot of the times we'll go and do what we call an OT's compromise assessment. One of the number one things we see are multiple means of remote access, and remote access that's completely bypassing the IDMZ that's been taking great care to stand up, and, care and expense, I should say, only to have somebody completely bypassing that to get direct access into the OT environment, when the whole idea is to keep them separate and very separate. So five critical controls really give you examples of what to do, how to do it from a overall standpoint, true guidance, rather than um, some of these frameworks are a little too granular, but this is probably your best starting point as far as shoring up your defenses.
It's, as you were talking, it made me think too, because Teresa, I know you asked the question to us the other day, just around like what we're seeing in the industry. And well, the other important key factor here is I think because manufacturing has historically lagged, from IT in terms of technology rate of change, implementation, cost to do so, risk to the production environment, all that stuff. You're also seeing this unique thing happening worldwide where there's a lot of compliance reporting framework requirement adoption being driven by countries and governments, right? So it's not just nation state attackers and adversaries that are like waking up and getting paid heavily to come in and disrupt life, right? Us as the good citizens, we stand up every day and our governments are saying, hey, reporting is critical. Like, we need to know, right? Within 48 hours, have you been hit, so we can do investigation, forensics, triage, response, whatever. And when you're in critical infrastructure, it has a very different impact than if you're Bob's Cookie Factory in Chicago somewhere, right? Not saying one's different than the other in that sense, but yeah, the criticality of like how that impacts the human population. So if you look at Europe with the NIS2 directive in terms of compliance, they're putting hard timelines, right? By October, November of this year, there's going to have to be conformity to adoption and assessment work that happens. And then comes the actual remediation and compliance, right? If you're operating in the European Union, we see very much the same thing in South Pacific, Australia, where Dragos and Rockwell both operate together. A lot of heavy, government regulations coming down from the US and Canada in terms of critical infrastructure. So, this whole like waiting to do something thing, it's now becoming a non-negotiable in some industries and in some cases where you have to go do that. And the excuse of like, we don't know how much it's going to cost and how much time it's going to take to go do it. There's a lot of really good partners out there that can help coach you through the journey, bite the elephant, take the elephant one bite at a time, help you pick the first step. You don't have to do all of it at the same time. So you're not alone in this, I guess, is my final comment.
Yeah. Don't just look to satisfy checkboxes. Find a real true response to what you're doing. Is this really going to have an effect, or is this just going to satisfy some regulator? Ask yourself that. Do you want real defense, or do you want to just have the bare minimum, right? And that's again, that partnership can really help as far as acknowledging that it's a journey. It's a step forward every time, and it's constant. You're never going to be finished.
Well, as we wrap up here, I have to say this is great information. It's really nuts and bolts information that our listeners can use. And there's more. I want to tell the listeners there's more links in the show notes where you can get more resources. And one of them is a Q&A I've done with Dave and Kamil. It's a 2-page PDF. It's a good read. Make sure you click on that and download that. So thank you both. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much.
So listeners, thank you for joining us. Please give us a 5-star rating and a review. We really appreciate it. I'm Theresa Houck with the Journal Magazine, and we'll talk again soon.